Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center in Sydney and the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, joining you from a beautiful weather here at U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, Australia. We're going to talk today about the IP4, the NATO connection with America's allies in Asia, Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand. East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. But thanks to Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Xi Jinping, East and West have been meeting quite a bit to deal with what some people call a single front, the Euro-Atlantic, the Indo-Pacific. Joined today by three of the leading experts on international security to unpack where the IP4, where the Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific security relationship is, where it's heading. So delighted to have with me three scholars listeners will have heard of and read. Elizabeth Saunders is head of the Saltzman Institute and a professor at Columbia University. Louise Simón is a professor and director of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy in Brussels, a leading thinker on NATO and NATO's relationship with the Indo-Pacific. And Professor Chung Min Lee, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and longtime advisor to Korean governments on grand strategy and democracy and other things. We'll look at where we are with the IP4. I think it's fair to say there was great momentum and now there's uncertainty about the future of this connection between NATO and American alliances in the Indo-Pacific. But there shouldn't be uncertainty because the other side, sometimes called CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, are certainly tightening up their relationships. So we'll come back to all that. But maybe start with the history. Louise, welcome back to Sydney. And if I can start with you, bring us up to speed on the IP4. And in particular, I think that the U.S. has been on again, off again, pushing for this, but the real change came within Europe, I think. And the current momentum really had a lot to do with Europe's relationship with China. But bring us up to speed on the IP4 and the NATO strategic concept and thinking in Brussels and across Europe about the relevance of the Indo-Pacific theater to European security.
Thanks, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be here. As I see it, there are maybe two main factors that sort of underscore the geostrategic interdependence between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. One, which is more structural, it has to do with the fact that the security, the deterrence and alliance architectures of both regions sort of rely on the same final backstop, which is U.S. military power. That was also the case during the Cold War, in which Asian allies felt more the presence and the importance of the European theater. Now it's sort of, in a way, the other way around. And the other factor is sort of more contingent and relates to the growing strategic cooperation you alluded to the CRINC, but perhaps more specifically between China and Russia, right? And I think over the last few years, we've sort of on the coattails of the Ukraine war, we've witnessed the emergence of two sets of, if you will, adversarial geopolitical alignments, right? One, which is more continental, this sort of pan-Eurasian group of authoritarian powers, China, the CRINCs, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And on the other side, we've seen growing cooperation between U.S. allies in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific in particular. And this is more of a democratic, but also a rimland and maritime connection, right? But I think it's important to note, and you also alluded to that, I think it's important to note that this paradigm of adversarial geopolitical alignments has been promoted in large part by the United States and more specifically by the previous administration, right? So the Biden administration sort of underscored the need for a global approach to security and to alliances and for defending global norms whenever and wherever they were challenged, right? And it sort of construed the war in Ukraine as part of a broader geopolitical struggle. It treated China and Russia, but also North Korea and Iran as a more or less coherent bloc and fostered cross-regional cooperation between U.S. allies. And now we have a new administration in the U.S., which seems to be challenging. And I say seems to be because it's not entirely clear to me yet. And there's also an interagency element to that discussion. And perhaps Elizabeth can talk more about that. It seems to be challenging each and every one of these premises, right? So far, Trump has established a clear ranking of priorities, with China seemingly standing first and coming first and everything else being secondary, even superfluous. He also appears to reject the logic of treating China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran as a bloc, and may even be looking for divisions within this group. And it's also unclear to what extent he's interested in fostering cooperation between U.S. allies, as he's pushing U.S. allies in Europe and in the Pacific to stick to the respective regions, right? So I think that's more or less where we are. Having said that, European and Indo-Pacific allies have their own interests, and even if they accept the Trump logic of focusing primarily on their respective regions, they also want to keep that global perspective. And at the same time, the partnership between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran is showing remarkable resilience. We talk a lot about resilience. Well, how about that for resilience? So there's pushback from reality, right? And in addition to that, I think the Trump administration's emphasis on outcompeting China also underscores the importance of cross-regional cooperation, particularly when it comes to economic security, tech, and so on and so forth.
We'll come back to where we are and where the Trump administration's thinking is in a moment. But what we need to do is also understand sort of structurally, and I'll come to Liz in a minute on this, structurally, how much momentum is there behind this? This was not, this IP4, this convergence of Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific theaters is not just a sort of theoretical construct somebody in the White House had. In the Biden administration, there's a compelling geopolitical logic to it. But for Europe, it seems to me the big turning point was actually even before Ukraine. It was about economics and assumptions about economic relations with China and interdependence with China. Is that a fair assessment of what really first caused the European turn?
I think so. I think Europe has had its own pivot to the Indo-Pacific. I wouldn't say independent from that of the United States, because nothing in Europe is fully independent from the United States, but it's had its own dynamic as well. And that has to do with the recognition that the center of gravity in terms of economic growth, technological innovation, and so on and so forth has been moving eastwards towards the Indo-Pacific. So yeah, I think that's a key factor.
And I ask because we'll, in a moment, talk about where the Trump administration's debate is, and the future of the IP4 is uncertain, at least in terms of American leadership right now. But this structural factor matters. If there's an overwhelming geopolitical logic to something, it tends to not go away. And so, Liz, you write about this and teach about this. How do you see that? The structure, the geopolitics, almost the theoretical explanations for why this is happening and how much momentum it has.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is, and I should say thank you for having us, Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here in Sydney. The structural piece of it, I think, is really important. And there's a long history of the U.S. trying to create cross-regional, not just cooperation, but even intervention, right? Going all the way back to the Cold War and trying to get Europeans to get involved in the Vietnam War and send troops and so forth. Efforts that really went nowhere. And so I think what's really important to realize is that during the Cold War, there was hardly any economic interdependence between the two superpowers. And so the logic of staying in your own neighborhood made tremendous sense. And I think the U.S. sort of came around to that once the war was clearly a failure. And today, the structural logic, to me, kind of the dynamic of trying to get NATO, for example, to spend more, right? This goes all the way back. Presidents since Eisenhower have been saying, you need to spend more on your own defense. Europeans need to step up. But then whenever they do try to step out of their, to strike out on their own, the U.S. says, oh, no, don't do that. And there's a little bit of that going on here, I think, as well, where the Trump administration doesn't seem interested in any of this IP4, NATO, and we can talk about that in a minute. But the structural imperative is there. And now Trump has gotten a lot of increased defense spending in Asia and in Europe. It remains to be seen exactly what form that will take and what they'll spend the money on and all of that, or if they'll spend the money. But if the structural logic, as you say, holds, you get back to this dynamic of you want your allies to stand up for themselves, but you still want to control them. And at some point, if they get enough independence, you can't control them anymore. And so I do wonder if we are kind of hurtling towards a moment where the structural kind of takes over and has a logic of its own. And that may suggest that maybe this cooperation can survive without the U.S. as the driver. That's a lot of speculating, many steps down many different roads. But I think this question of, do you need the U.S. to be driving this is inextricable from what you're talking about in terms of the structural drivers of this geopolitical imperative.
Right. So you may not need the U.S. to drive it, and we may not have the U.S. driving it for the foreseeable future. But don't you need the U.S. to provide the engineering and the capabilities of NATO and the capabilities of Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, highly dependent on American technology, nuclear umbrella, except for France and Britain, war planning, sea lane control. I mean, it's a long list. Satellites and strategic intelligence, cyber capabilities, like highly dependent.
Absolutely.
And so you're not saying that there's a structural logic where Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and sort of the European parts of NATO, perhaps under France, create a new alliance without the US. It's just who drives the agenda and who moves it forward that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think it also goes beyond hardware, right? I mean, hardware, I think it's, even with a lot of countries right now, Canada, for example, unlikely candidate to be rethinking its relationship with the US, but here we are thinking seriously about where they're buying their hardware from, right? But that's a question that is, maybe a decade from real, in the time frame it takes to develop these platforms, very, very far away, right? So I'm thinking more of, we live in an age, in contrast to the Cold War, where the superpowers are economically intertwined. And there has been a lot of debate, Louise can speak to this better than I can, about pushing Europe to see China as a threat, the way the US does, and the economic interdependence between Europe and China, which gives exposure to both sides in terms of, leverage. And the US has been unhappy with Europe for not taking a stronger stance against China for a long time. And so that, just in terms of foreign policy and trade policy, privacy, things that happen on a much quicker timeline than decisions about hardware, I think some of that logic, that cooperation, you might see some of that continue even without US direction.
Yeah. So 20 years ago, as the Chinese Communist Party was preparing to pass the anti-secession law, legalizing the use of force against Taiwan, they always had that option, that strategy, but they were passing a law to make it official. They would use force against Taiwan if necessary to prevent independence and all the rest. As that was all being undertaken in Beijing, the EU was preparing to lift the arms embargo on China that had been put in place after Tiananmen in 1989. I was the senior Asia official in the NSC. Our Europe counterparts were exhausted because we're not in the first period of transatlantic tension. And there was a lot of tension between the Bush administration and France and Germany in particular. Old Europe, as Rumsfeld used to say. And so the Europe guys didn't want to fight it. So it fell to me and my counterparts in defense and state to say to the Europeans that we are opposed. The US is opposed to lifting the arms embargo right now, as the Chinese are debating the wrong signal, guys. And it was a cathartic moment in the transatlantic relationship. I personally enjoyed it because as a senior Asia person, I got to actually have dinner with the French ambassador and the Italian ambassador. So my culinary variety improved briefly so therefore
the theaters did meet.
In culinary terms, I'm a big fan of the theaters meeting, but it was a cathartic moment for the EU, and NATO really had to drive the EU and the UK in particular. And then we sort of fell off. It's somewhat cyclical, but it has been a longstanding US goal. And I think one of the structural factors is basically power, pure power. The US cannot handle both theaters alone. We've lost the ability for two major contingencies for some time. But I also wonder, Liz, if maybe there's in theoretical terms, external balancing is a logical way to redress a deteriorating balance of power. You get your allies to work together more, create more of a collective security, more of a deterrent. But is there a little bit of a buck passing element possibly that Europe, instead of wanting to spend more, we'll do a little more Asia? And maybe Japan, or am I being too cynical?
Well, it's hard to imagine, what does it mean for Europe to do a little more Asia if it's not,
Well, instead of increasing defense spending, you use diplomatic outreach to other partners to say you're dealing with security problems is what I'm getting at.
Well, but so here we get into some of the confusion. I don't want to jump the gun, but some of the confusion of the Trump administration, which is simultaneously pushing for all allies in Asia and in Europe to spend more and to stand up, take responsibility for their own security. That's a long-standing Trump principle that goes way back to before it's one of his few kind of really clear things he believes in and has pushed for and spent a lot of time on in both terms.
But also a Biden and Obama principle.
Yes,
they were just more polite about it.
Absolutely.
Right?
You can go back, and you can find quotes going all the way back to Eisenhower. You need to spend more, stick up for yourself. But again, the U.S. has a very strong, it wants its allies to do certain things and to not do certain things. And we coerced them in the Cold War to not get nuclear weapons in many cases, West Germany, Taiwan. And there's been great scholarship actually on that that's come out in the last few years. So in any event, they're actually getting more pledges for greater defense spending. But then the Trump administration is also telling everybody to stay in their own neighborhoods. And that's a change. And maybe there have been ebbs and flows, but there's always been a desire on the US part to get support and help and pitching in wherever the US has security problems, whether it's Iraq or Vietnam, et cetera, right? And so it's very strange to have these two imperatives, I think, coming at the same time, telling NATO not to get involved in the Indo-Pacific region, for example. And so I do wonder whether there comes a point where Europe maybe says, for example, we don't know what the policy is here. It's a little bit confused. And there is, as Luis said, maybe an interagency dimension to it, which is true of every administration. But in this case, I think it's manifesting in this.
It's hyper true.
Yes, hyper true. I like that. Hyper true. At that point, if you have invested all this money in defense, don't you get the right to decide? I mean, I'm thinking like a European who's just spent all this money to increase defense spending. If you want to talk to Asia, why can't you talk to Asia? Why can't you coordinate with Asia, right? So I do think there will come a point where the confused policy may achieve escape velocity, right? Like it may then have momentum of its own that is just totally independent of the US. Now, whether that happens during the next 3 years of the Trump administration or if it takes another decade, that's up to a lot of people outside the US as well. Xi Jinping, among others, right?
So within Europe, I can imagine France thinking that would be a great future. Britain, maybe not so much. Within Asia, it's hard for me to picture an Asian government that would like that decoupling from the US. I think it would be seen as much more problematic.
Well, I don't see that this contingency as decoupling as more dealing with the reality of a retrenched US.
Let me rephrase it then. I think, so for example, trust in the US right now in polls in Japan, Korea, and Australia is the lowest it's ever been. Support for alliance with the US is the highest it's ever been. So I think there's an urgency to keeping the US in that maybe drives Asia allies more. I don't know. We can let Luis come back to this. Let me ask Chung Min, though, before we get to that. What is the logic, if you're in Seoul or Tokyo or Canberra, of the IP4 and a connection to these theaters? And if there is logic, what caused that awakening?
First of all, thank you for having us today in your podcast. I would go back to the Korean War because the Korean War triggered, in many respects, a globalized American defense structure. And so the creation of NATO, it didn't happen because of the Korean War, but it was a wake-up call at the early stages of the Cold War. So there was a historical connection between a conflict in Asia and security in NATO.
If I can just interject, there's a wonderful, it's always worth interjecting about Bob Jervis, right? So there's a wonderful sort of hidden gem in the Bob Jervis oeuvre about this very issue.
Robert Jervis, the late, dearly beloved Columbia professor.
Yes, it's titled something like The Influence of the Korean War on the Cold War, and it's exactly this point.
And so I think what happened over the last 50, 60 years, Mike, and you were basically in the seat of government in the Bush administration, is that U.S. grand strategy was premised on two legs, transatlantic alliance and trans-Pacific. And so the whole U.S. grand strategy was, let's make Europe and Asia rich and more powerful. And that happened over 50 years. And as America's role, it doesn't dwindle, but as other powers grow, i.e. China or EU or Japan, South Korea, Australia, etc., I think America began to realize, okay, we have these two huge, powerful, dynamic, democratic allies. Why can't we let them talk to each other a little bit more? And I think the first phase of this was direct trade. The second phase was, in my opinion, the outbreak of the Ukrainian War. So if you look at what the Ukrainian War did for Japanese psychology, the Gulf War was a huge wake-up call for them globally 20 years ago, but the Ukrainian War was a wake-up call for Korea. And if you look at what Koreans have done, and this, I don't know whether it's sustainable or not, we have sold altogether $17 billion worth of arms to Poland since the outbreak of the Ukrainian War. South Korea is the third largest arms exporter to NATO after basically the US. And France is also a huge supplier. This would have been unimaginable 20, 30 years ago, as you well know. So America did one thing right, which was resuscitate the economies of Europe and Asia, make them rich and powerful with strong armies. And now we're asking ourselves, okay, with not a lingering US, but shifting American commitments to either NATO or Asian allies, then what is left for Asian allies to do but to also work with our European partners? Now, as Luis will basically know, this doesn't mean that Korean president or the Japanese prime minister wakes up every single morning and says, oh my gosh, what's my counterpart doing in Berlin or Paris or London? But at least 5% of their thinking is focused on Europe and vice versa. And that 5%, I believe, is a critical litmus test for where the triangle goes in the future.
So you have a situation now, which the Korean government doesn't explicitly acknowledge, where Russia is firing North Korean artillery rounds at the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are firing Korean artillery rounds at the Russians and North Koreans.
That's right, yes.
Yeah,
well, this is also what I mean. Like, if you're European, you spend time worrying about Putin invading the Baltic countries or Poland. You have to worry about North Korea and also think about how you can encourage South Korea to keep doing what it's doing. I mean, this is inextricable.
I mean, by law, we cannot send, quote unquote, weapons to war zones, but we are able to send arms to Poland, the Czech Republic, and so forth. And this is something that the Korean arms industry woke up to because NATO, as you know, Mike, mothballed all of their defense industries, primarily Germany and France, after the Cold War. And so when Poland needed desperately, or Ukraine needed desperately ammunitions, the only country that could supply NATO-compatible, American-compatible ammunition were the South Koreans.
So the defense industrial piece of this, which is always important in alliance, is really interesting. Hanwha Industries is opening up major production in Australia and in Poland. The Royal Australian Navy just announced it will procure the Japanese frigate Mogami.
Yes.
I actually see this not as hedging from the U.S. or reducing reliance on the U.S. That is an element. But I see it really as creating a sort of federated alliance defense industrial capability. The U.S. is, 1% of world shipbuilding now? Korea and Japan combined are closer to 35, I think, or 40%. So not just the US, but Europe also is going to need the industrial power of Japan and Korea, and potentially Australia, by the way, which in its own way is advancing armaments. So that piece of it's really quite important, isn't it?
And also the Japanese and the South Koreans and Australians also need European technology. You look at what satellite geospatial tracking capabilities, of course, 90% is basically American, but you have leading European space companies that are working closely with Japanese and Korean firms. That was not heard of, 20, 30 years ago. So there's a rationale for closer Asian-European defense technology cooperation. I think in the next 4 or 5 years, as the Japanese come into the arms exporting market, what will happen? They will face stiffer competition with the British, the Germans, and the French, because NATO wants to buy European arms. But also in March this year, for the first time, NATO signed an agreement with South Korea after Japan as a major science and technology cooperation partner. So that's something that I think the Japanese and Koreans do not take for granted, because they look at that as a critical barometer for where the technology supremacy race lies ahead.
And by the way, I personally, my dissertation was on defense industry and alliances, but I personally do not think the Mogami decision, the GCAP, the UK, Italy, Japan consortium on jet fighters, the Hanwha
G6,
move to Poland, all of these things, that's not about Trump. There's a industrial military operational logic. Louise, we don't hear a lot from Europe about the Japanese, Korean, or Australian defense industrial relationships, but is this front of mind for people at NATO and in European capitals?
I think so. Sort of going back to what Chung Min was saying, and perhaps connecting it to the strategic piece and what you were asking earlier about the US, because I do think that these two regions are connected primarily through the US. I do think that, at least from a strategic and security perspective. From an economic perspective, it's a slightly different ballgame. If you look at it, if you look at the whole cross-regional conversation that we're having from a network perspective, which is a great way of thinking about connections and quantifying, measuring connections, then you could say that in the cross-regional conversation, the US is clearly, undoubtedly the hub. You could even say that if you're looking about the security architecture of Asia, the US is the hub, but all this narrative about hub and spokes. And even in Europe, you have NATO, which is multilateral, but the US is actually the hub. It's the main hub within Europe, right? So it is true for Europe and for Asia separately. It is hyper true, to quote you, when you're talking cross-regional, right? So the key question for me right now is then, how can we continue with this program in a way that is palatable to the US today, right? Because if the US is not on board, then you're going to get very little traction, right? By sort of working around US red lines, right? And we keep hearing from the Trump administration that European and Indo-Pacific allies should stick to their corners strategically and focus on their respective regions. I don't think anyone disagrees with that, actually, either in Europe or in Asia. I don't think you need to convince the Japanese that their main priority is China and the Indo-Pacific, or that you need to convince the Poles or even the Germans that their main priority is deterrence in the eastern flank, right? But I don't think that means that there isn't any space left for cross-regional cooperation. And that connects with the defense industrial piece, right? I think I would perhaps distinguish between what I would call the upstream and the downstream or operational aspects of deterrence that have to do with military strategy and with warfighting, and the upstream, meaning the generation of capabilities, technologies, and skill sets that you need to underpin deterrence, right? And if you think about it, even if the main competitor or the referent competitor is different, China in Asia, Russia in Europe, and for Korea, North Korea primarily, NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners actually face a strikingly similar operational and strategic problem, which is how to implement deterrence by denial in the regions in a context in which the main security guarantor is external to the region, right? And I think that underscores the potential for synergies when it comes to generating the capabilities, the technologies, even the operational concepts needed, and defense industrial arrangements and standards, right? So even if NATO and IP4 remain operationally focused on their respective regions or backyards, I think we could think of a sort of cross-theater ecosystem of capabilities, technologies, defense industrial arrangements that bolsters deterrence by denial. And by the way, that by simplifying standards and promoting competition within that US alliance ecosystem, you actually reduce the number of systems, platforms, and munitions, yielding significant gains also in terms of efficiency, scale, and speed of delivery. So it's a doge from a cross-regional macro perspective. And I think shipbuilding is actually a great example, and we should be thinking about how European allies can plug into elements of AUKUS or into elements of the US shipbuilding dynamic with Korea and with Japan.
So we've, I think, spelled out pretty well among the four of us the geopolitical logic to growing convergence of the NATO alliances and US alliances in the Indo-Pacific. We've talked, I think, about the logic. Won't be easy, but the logic and already the evidence of defense industrial and technology relations growing and networking across the region. The IP4 was begun as a leaders summit. The NATO summit inviting the four Indo-Pacific alliance. By the way, we're tucking New Zealand back into this alliance phrase, which I do deliberately, but US policy is a little more gray on that one. But for my part, we count the Kiwis, absolutely, as does NATO. That was a summit. It was a leaders movement. So a lot of the momentum is at the leaders level. And I think there's some real question marks, most notably with the Trump administration, where you have senior officials, Bridge Colby, reportedly the number 3 in the Defense Department, telling the Europeans, we really don't want you spending your effort on the Indo-Pacific. Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference basically saying, Europe, you're going to have to take care of yourself because we're focused on Asia. So you have senior people in the administration sort of pushing these theaters apart. You have others, I think perhaps you'd say State Department and the Congress saying, no, we need to keep doing this. Meanwhile, in the Indo-Pacific, you have a weakened Japanese leadership. You have an Australian leadership that is a bit ambivalent about national security as a narrative, to put it one way. You have a new Korean government that's quite interesting. And the summit we just saw with President Trump suggested maybe Lee Jae-myung might be a more proactive Korean leader in the style of Lee Myung-bak, sort of trying to lead. But let me get each of you to assess the leadership and the strategic thinking at the summit level. I think at the operational and defense industry level, people get it. But what about the political level? I'll start with you, Chung Min. Actually, no, I'm going to go with you last because you may have the best answer, most hopeful answer of anyone. So I'll start with you, Louise. Within Europe, look, they're on their back foot. They're just trying to manage Donald Trump on Ukraine. Did they have the bandwidth or the political support to think about the Indo-Pacific at the political leadership level in Europe right now?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I think right now, as you were saying, Mike, the main focus of European leaders is on managing the Ukraine situation specifically. And if I may say so, I think European leaders are doing relatively well on that front, considering how complicated the picture is, in the sense that they have, initially there were some voices saying, oh no, we need to push back, we need to reject this notion of peace. But then very early into the administration, European leaders actually said, okay, no, we're going to engage with this peace frame. But here are our views and here are our red lines, right? They've been supportive of a peace process as long as it met certain criteria. And I think they've been pretty consistent on that. I think the British and the French in particular, they've played a very constructive role and rather efficient diplomacy with the Trump administration to show that there are red lines not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe. I think that is the main focus right now of Europeans at the leaders level. I think there's this realization that China, also to some extent DPRK, of course, because they've been sending troops to the front line, but that China in particular has been aiding and abetting Russia's aggression on Ukraine, particularly its defense industrial, underpinning its defense industrial effort. And I think, and we were talking about this earlier informally, I think this is probably the single most important factor in swinging Europe's view and Europe's perception of China. I think Europeans are very much committed to this notion that the theaters are connected in terms of diplomacy, strategically, geoeconomically, and they see the logic for defense industrial cooperation, but it is not, European engagement at the strategic, at the security level in the Indo-Pacific is not a top priority for the leaders right now.
And is it fair to say it's falling because they have so many urgent transatlantic and Ukraine things that are consuming their attention? So, for example, reportedly, President Macron opposed the opening of a NATO office in Tokyo. Is there hostility within Europe to the NATO strategic concept, focusing on China, doing more with Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand? Is there hostility or is it just sort of no time?
No, I think that was more of a French.
That was a French thing.
Thing. That was more of a French
There's
thing.
There's always a French thing.
It's always a French thing, yeah.
And I think it had to do with the fact that the French didn't want to send the signal that their Asia policy was dependent or linked to that of the United States, that it was an autonomous policy, an independent policy, even though the French are actually, when it comes to thinking about China, amongst the most aligned with U.S. thinking in Europe. So that's a bit of a paradox there. But the Trump administration has been sending a very clear message to the European allies. Hegseth said it during his first visit to NATO back in February, is like, we want you to take primary responsibility. We're going to focus primarily on the Indo-Pacific. This message has been pretty consistent. So I think there's a sense in Europe that sort of compels Europeans to focus primarily on their own region. And I would actually, going back to what you were saying earlier, I would actually go even further than that. I would say that it's actually in the European interest for the U.S. to rebalance towards the Indo-Pacific and to focus most of its efforts on the Indo-Pacific, because that is where the main threat/challenge to U.S. power is coming from. It's coming from the Indo-Pacific.
So, Liz, what's your response to that robust defense of the Trump administration's grand strategy? There is a logic. There is a logic to... And look, Obama wanted to do it. Frankly, Bush wanted to do it. Isn't Trump, he's being a little rough about it, but isn't there something
there is. I don't think the issue is focus on your regions. It makes sense. Get your own house in order, clean up your house before you worry about somebody else's, right? But what's stuck in my mind since you said it was the polling in Australia, right? There's this incredible demand for better trust. The trust is low, but the desire for more cooperation and the, desire for the alliance itself is still very, very high, higher than it's ever been. To me, that suggests there's demand for the alliance that's not being fulfilled because of the low trust, right? So I think of this in terms of demand and supply, right? There's encouraging focusing on your own region, but then there's counterproductive, past a certain point, if you push them away too far, they come back around and meet each other, in Ukraine or something like that, right? And it's also the case that whenever big contingencies come around, you always want help. And so there's a point beyond which it's staying in your own neighborhood, but are you really going to keep the fire trucks to yourself when the other neighborhood is on fire?
Do you really want China to think that Europe would not be involved?
Yeah.
Even if it wouldn't?
And it
or
clearly
vice versa?
is, right?
Yeah.
And so there just is, I think that there's just a level of, again, if you push too hard, there will come a point where there's escape velocity and you've sort of succeeded to the point of it being a Pyrrhic victory, right? Where you can no longer control what these allies do. That is the logical consequence of pushing for independence in their defense and security policies. And successive administrations have wanted more spending, but have always backed away from that point, right? Like they don't want to let go because they would like to retain some leverage. So then you add on top of that, I think something we really haven't talked about, which is uncertainty around U.S. power and U.S. R&D prowess, the tech race. Some of the policies that Trump is pursuing are completely opposite to the idea of the U.S. maintaining its role as the leader in all of these different sectors, right? And so the supply is going to diminish potentially of the ability to kind of convene these meetings, or even just the supply of the, alliance commitment. And at least in Europe, there's obviously a long history of debate about why is there no NATO in Asia, but at least in NATO, these multilateral convenings and kind of, showing up with your squad of allies was considered a real strength. Like it was always the U.S. pushing for that kind of display. You had Zelensky invited to come, and the Europeans decided that they needed to come and flank him in Washington. And you had not only the individual heads of state, but also Mark Rutte, the head of the NATO Secretary General, and Ursula von der Leyen, right, from the European Council, which it just doesn't happen very often. And so the idea of the Europeans flying together of their own accord in order to kind of back up Zelensky, I think is evidence of this sort of receding supply of political will. Trump has never liked multilateralism to begin with. He wants to always be one-on-one with each of, he's the hub and spoke kind of personal diplomacy leadership style. And I think what you're seeing is there's still demand for the U.S. to be the center, and it's just going to be increasingly unlikely that there will be the supply.
It was a remarkable image that those of us who teach international relations would have given a student an F on their paper if they'd predicted it. But here we are. Truly remarkable. You know what it wasn't? Macron and Starmer and Rutte meeting in Paris and saying, fine, the Americans can play their game. We will defend Ukraine. That's what it wasn't. It was evidence that
I think
European leaders know that what Louise was saying, that they may be difficult, but they're the only Americans we have.
Well, I think in this particular case, there was a real fear. It was really about mitigating downside risk. I mean, I think there was a real fear that week he was going to give something away that could be really dreadful for Ukraine. And so it wasn't so much about who's going to give Ukraine arms. It was more about what is this peace plan you have?
No, absolutely. But those European leaders were not meeting with Trump. They were meeting with Trump to shape American strategy, to push the U.S. on certain presidential decision-making in a direction that worked for Europe. And even though it looked a little bit in diplomacy to travel to another country's capital and meet with a leader like that, it has significance. I mean, potentially quite unpopular in Europe, but I think they knew that the European public expected them to get this transatlantic relationship right. It was they could have gone in a different direction, theoretically, hypothetically, and really just sort of said, "We're all right, fine, America's gone." So I saw that as remarkable, troubling, but at the same time, evidence that European leaders know they have to get the transatlantic right. To me, it conjured images of Abe Shinzo of Japan, who in the first Trump administration, frankly, more than any European leader, played that role at the G7 and across the Pacific. But now it seems to me that sort of role has shifted to Europe in some ways. And Chung Min in Asia, I don't think Prime Minister Albanese of Australia is looking to play that role. I don't think Ishiba, he probably would like to, but I don't think he has the political legs to do it. Luxon in New Zealand is scrappy. I like him, but New Zealand's not a big enough player, frankly. And so in some ways, all eyes are on Korea right now. And if I say that Lee Jae-myung could be the next Abe, I would not be doing him a favor in Korean politics, so I guess I won't say that. But is there going to be some momentum from within the Indo-Pacific on all of these larger strategic questions?
I think so, Mike. And obviously, I don't think any Korean, left or right or center or anywhere in between, would say that Lee Jae-myung's foreign policy role model would be the late Prime Minister of Japan, Abe Shinzo. But having said that, I think what is really remarkable about Lee Jae-myung was that prior to going to Washington for the summit with Donald Trump, he made an official visit to Japan. So for the first time since ties were normalized in 1965, a sitting South Korean president always flew to D.C. first for his or her first foreign trip. but this was the first time that he visited Japan and then went to DC. And so people might say, well, that's basically more optics, but no. I think for a progressive leader like President Lee Jae-myung to come to Japan and say that Japanese-Korean ties are crucial and that he wants to drive U.S.-Korea-Japan relations into the future, that's music to Tokyo's ears and to Washington.
And he could do it because it's sort of Nixon goes to China. He could do it because he's from the left.
And I think, of course, he will have to say the same thing vis-a-vis, sunshine policy towards North Korea, reaching out to Kim Jong-un. He told that exact same message to Donald Trump. But overall, there is a space where I think a Korean president can play a meaningful role. It doesn't mean it's going to be super important. In the bandwidth of Korean foreign policy, as you know, or Japanese foreign policy, 80% of their space is consumed by two countries, North Korea and China. But now you add in Russia after the Ukrainian war and the fact that there are 14,000 plus North Korean soldiers and more fighting alongside Russian forces. So for Korea, this is a moment whereby you can actually step up a little bit, up to the plate. And my last point here is, if you look at the Eurasian map, the reason why there is peace in the world still is because of the two anchors at the corners of Eurasia, NATO and US allies in Asia. That is the biggest asset that the democratic and free world has. And maintaining that on both ends of Eurasia not only depends on the US critically, but also on more direct and crucial ties, limited as it may be, between Asian allies and our European partners.
I'll conclude with this observation that you each have a final word of wisdom for our listeners. I left the NSC in 2006. I engaged in a lot of second track, 1.5 track scenario exercises with Chinese scholars and former officials. The past 5 years, that's been harder and harder. But something that's always struck me was that the assumptions that were clearly behind our Chinese counterparts thinking about a Korean contingency or something in the first island chain, the assumption was Europe would be completely neutral. That was clearly their assumption. And I suspect, I can't prove it, that about 6 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, perhaps strategic thinkers in China began wondering, with this NATO strategic concept and other things, maybe Europe's not so neutral after all. And I think for deterrence, for dissuasion, we, the United States, but also NATO, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, want the Chinese to wonder whether this collective security NATO arrangement in Europe and these converging bilateral alliances in Asia could, because of Chinese action, become a global collective security arrangement. That's a very powerful dissuader and deterrent. And what worries me the most right now is we're not sending that signal, any of us. Last thoughts. Start with you, Chung Min.
The Global Times, China's English party mouthpiece, chastised South Korea and partially Japan for telling the Americans that we want to help rebuild America's shipping industry, make American shipping great again. And it's because they're scared that the Japanese and the Koreans will collaborate on making American sea power much stronger than it is. And that's exactly why the Japanese are building these frigates for Australia. That's exactly why the Koreans are working closely with the Philippine Navy and so forth. And that is a security plus. It's not going to be decisive, Mike, but it is a security plus that the Japanese and Koreans realize can happen. And that plus security is going to be a little bit better if we work closely with our NATO partners.
I think, again, I go back to the U.S. political will and its supply of sort of momentum. It's the momentum, it's the hardware, it's the diplomatic effort, right? Because these are all scarce resources. And I think the problem is that the first Trump administration, you still had a lot of people from the world that Chung Min has been describing, right? The world of we have prosperity and peace because of these two pillars in Europe and Asia. And the alliances are extremely valuable and we need to maintain them and nurture them, right? I mean, some of the research that I've done on diplomacy in crisis, leaders don't, in a crisis, you don't fly to go look your adversary in the eye, right? That's one of the ironies of the Alaska summit, right? Bush didn't go to Baghdad in 1991. He went to Geneva and Baker, right? The president and the secretary of state, when a crisis hits, they go talk to their allies and they get their ducks in a row. And so I just go back to, if the United States is not interested in trade pacts anymore that set standards. It's not interested in convening multilateral groupings to get ducks in a row. And it's also shrinking its defense. It's not even its defense industrial base so much as its economic and intellectual power, right? Its R&D and all of that, right? Decreases in federal funding. I just have a hard time imagining that the U.S. role as we know it can continue. And therefore, nature abhors a vacuum, right? That's something we all teach our students.
Chung Min?
Mike, just quickly, a Japanese colleague you know very well, Yoichi Funabashi, and I are going to co-author a book called Going Alone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not as if we are going to basically take care of defense totally on our own without the Americans. But for the first time, I think the Japanese and South Koreans have to think about defense with a U.S. that is not as committed to the region as before. It's Grand Strategy 1.0 for Tokyo and Seoul.
But I think it's not just, after the first Trump administration, you had Biden who was extremely committed,
Sure.
right? So let's imagine you get somebody from either party that is committed after this Trump administration. I think this is where the supply comes in, right? Can that person recommit?
Or recreate the alliance structure so it is as resilient as it was.
Yes, exactly. But I think there's going to be some material drag the next president cannot avoid.
To answer your question, my best guess is the Chinese are fully aware that Europe could never stay neutral in a conflict in the Indo-Pacific. The question is, they will still try to mitigate Europe's degree of support for the United States, right? Just like Japan, Australia, ROK would not stay neutral in a conflict in Europe right now, right? I mean, we had Kishida saying Ukraine today can be tomorrow's East Asia, and we had the ROK fully engaged, particularly through defense industrial supplies. Europe cannot stay neutral diplomatically. I would go even further than that, and I would say that if you're talking about a direct war between the US and China in the first island chain, Europe would actually not stay neutral militarily either. So I think it would probably go even further than that. Probably not NATO as a whole, but certain key European powers, certainly the Brits. And I would actually argue also the French would not stay neutral. In a recent article with Toshi Yoshihara from the Center for Strategic Budgetary Assessments that was called Can Europe Fight Over Taiwan?, we looked at 4 factors that would probably determine or at least impinge on Europe's degree of military engagement in Taiwan. One would be the geographical scope. Is it confined to the Strait or to Taiwan and its immediate vicinity, or does it quickly expand into the broader Pacific and the Indian Ocean, where Europeans can make more of a contribution? What is the length? Is it short or is it long and protracted? A la Ukraine, which provides Europeans with opportunities to do what the ROK has done with Ukraine. Defense industrial assistance could be relevant. The most important question, what would be the nature of the U.S. involvement? Is it a la Ukraine, or Ukraine plus? So assistance, massive assistance, but assistance nonetheless without direct involvement, or does the U.S. engage militarily directly? This is the most crucial question for Europeans because they are allies of the United States. And then finally, is there a simultaneous contingency in Europe? Is there a simultaneous war, right? I think those 4 questions will determine.
That's really interesting and makes a lot of sense. I agree with you, Luis. When you were speaking, I was thinking of, I'm reading a book now on August 1914, not Barbara Tuchman, but more recent history, which illuminates the fact that Germany misread signals from London and thought that the British would remain neutral if they went through Belgium. And the British were not going to remain neutral if they went through Belgium. So that's what worries me. Is not the reality, but what the signals are. And we are sending, all of us, frankly, are sending very mixed signals right now. And the sooner we can get our act together, I hear you, Liz, on the capacity of the United States to deliver technology and economic power. I'm a little more bullish. I think the U.S. has quite a room to eat its seed corn. We're going to need it. It depends on how long it lasts, but there's capability and there's intent. And I think the intent part in some ways is where we are currently at the greatest risk, because the signals that are being sent, remarkably, given that the crinks are doing so much together, is problematic in terms of strategic signaling. But fascinating topic. Really appreciate it. You guys flew in from Brussels, DC, and I don't know if you came from Seoul or DC. So Chung Min has the easiest time of it, 2 hour time difference, but
1 hour.
1 hour now, but you guys held up really, really well. For people who want to follow Liz's work, and also Simón is one of the leading thinkers on this in Europe. And our conference is closed, but we'll be putting out a report on the future of the IP4. So thank you all very, very much.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.